Last week we discussed Daniel and the lion's den, and today we're going to talk about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the fiery furnace. You're probably familiar with that story. We're still in the book of Daniel, and it's recorded in chapter 3. So if I reference a verse, know that it is Daniel 3, verse whatever I mention. Okay, so if you remember, out of the exiles that were captured, Nebuchadnezzar had the best and the finest trained to work in his court for him. These were 4 young Hebrew men, Daniel, along with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they soon proved themselves to be exceptionally wise. And as a result, they found favor with the king. Daniel, it turns out, was the only man who could interpret one of Nebuchadnezzar's very troubling dreams. The king placed him in a very high position over the whole province of Babylon. And at Daniel's request, the king had appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to be his advisors. So let me set the stage for the story. King Nebuchadnezzar had this huge golden image built. It was 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. And the scripture doesn't expound or tell us what this image was of. It could have been something that represented the king himself, or it could have been an image of one of their false gods. But we do know that it was a symbol of King Nebuchadnezzar's power and his glory. He then ordered all of his leading officials throughout the empire to gather before the statue for its dedication. Now, this was a public statement that the empire is rooted in the common worship of this golden image. He then commanded that his people bow down and worship this image whenever they heard the musical herald. So those who disobeyed the order would be thrown into an immense blazing furnace. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, however, only worshiped the one true God of Israel, and they refused to bow down before this false idol. They were brought before Nebuchadnezzar, who reminded them of what would happen if they chose not to do it again. So in the middle of verse 15, Nebuchadnezzar states, "But if you do not worship, you will immediately be cast into the burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" Bold statement. But they were unmoved by this statement, and they replied back to him and said in verse 16, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship this golden image that you have set up." I love this. These young men did not base their decision on God saving them. They based their decision on their faith to God. And so they were willing to go to their deaths if God did not save them. Well, this enraged King Nebuchadnezzar. So he ordered that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than average. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were bound, and then they were cast into the flames. Now the fire was so hot that it killed the soldiers who escorted them into the furnace. But then something very unexpected happened. As King Nebuchadnezzar peered into the furnace, he marveled at what he saw. Daniel records his reaction in verse 24. The king says, Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men into the fire?" They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." And he answered and said, "But I see 4 men unbound walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." So who is this 4th person? Is it an angel? Is it a manifestation of the Christ? The scripture doesn't expound on that. But what we can take from this is it's a physical demonstration of God's presence with believers in distress. Now the king himself goes to the furnace and he calls to them, but pay attention as to how he addresses them at this point. Verse 26. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near the door of the burning fiery furnace, and he declared, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. So when they emerged, the scripture tells us that they were completely unharmed. Not even a hair on their head was singed, and their clothing didn't even smell of smoke. Needless to say, this made quite an impression on Nebuchadnezzar, who declared in verse 28, Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants, who trusted in him aside from the king's command, and yielded up their bodies rather than to serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree. Any people, nation, language that speaks against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses be laid in ruins. For there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So this declaration that the king made it possible for all the remaining Israelites who were in captivity, who were exiles, to be protected from any harm, and they were guaranteed freedom to worship their God. Again, we see God's continued faithfulness to his people, even while they're facing the consequences of being unfaithful to him. Now, I would like to point out that God's miraculous intervention in a moment of crisis is not a promise. If it were, we as believers would have no need to exercise our faith. The lesson here is that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego trusted God, and they were determined to be faithful without any guarantee of deliverance. They had no assurance that they would survive the flames, but they stood firm anyway because they were faithful to their God. Today, we as Christians, we're not threatened with a fiery death, but many of us are tested in many other ways. So when you're facing difficult times, please remember the story of faith and courage, and know that it is very possible to stand firm in your faith under all your circumstances. Thank you, and have a blessed day.